Hello, I'm Norfolk, and I'm here at the Jaipur Literary Festival, and I'm here with my new novel, John Saturnall's Feast. It's a story set in the 17th century in England of an orphan who becomes the greatest cook of his age, except for two things. He falls in love with the wrong girl, and the English Civil War intervenes. I first came to this story when I was reading a history of English cooking, and I know that in this country, as in many countries, English cooking doesn't have the best reputation. When I first thought of it, I thought of sheep's heads rolling around in cauldrons and appalling bread and grey sausages. And then I discovered that, in fact, in the 16th century, Britain had a great tradition of cooking. It was sophisticated, it was cosmopolitan, until the English Civil War happened. At that point, the whole tradition was disrupted. The cooks fled abroad, and their masters, the aristocrats, had their heads cut off in the English Civil War, or fled as well to France. And I asked myself at that point, what would you do if you were a cook? What if you'd worked in those kitchens? What if you'd worked your way up to the top? And it was very, very hard work. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then suddenly the world that you had trained yourself to serve disappeared. What would you do? That gave me the story for the book. And then I asked myself a second question. It was this: who would you be? Who would be this person who trained to be a cook? Because the apprenticeship for a cook in the 17th century was very, very hard. The kitchens were crowded with people. There was no electricity, so everything was done by hand. The instruments were very primitive. Sieves, for example, were made of horsehair, not from wire. Everything, if you wanted to whisk cream, you used a bundle of birch twigs. I don't know if you've ever tried to whisk cream using a bundle of birch twigs, but it takes a very, very long time. It's very hard work. If you want to wash up, use cold water. You can't afford to heat it. And instead of soap, you use cold ashes, because when the ash dissolves, it forms an alkaline, and you use that to dissolve the grease on the plates. So you would spend your early years up to your ankles in grey, cold water, whisking things with birch twigs and using a horsehair sieve. And then suddenly, all your efforts become for nothing. Who would you be if you were that person? And my answer to that was that you would be John Saturnall. So he grows up in the West Country of England. His mother is accused of being a witch. She's driven out of the village, and he's taken down to be apprenticed in the kitchens of Buckland Manor. Here he meets a young girl who, on his first acquaintance, he doesn't know who she is, called Lucretia, and they have a huge argument. It's at that point he discovers that she is the daughter of the Lord of the Manor, of course, and they become enemies. How that relationship progresses, if you want to know that, well, then you're going to have to read the book, I'm afraid. But that relationship does progress. And then he begins to work his way up through the kitchen, so you learn about 17th century cooking techniques and the recipes. I researched these recipes by reading the cookbooks of the time, which are a joyful experience because, of course, in the 17th century, nobody knew how to write a cookbook. It's not like now where they're all exactly the same. My favourite was one called The Closet of Sir Kenelm Digby Opened. And in that, he collected all the recipes which he heard from his friends. And amongst those was a particular detail, which I'll share with you. He said, in order to boil an egg, put it in the water, and so water simply shivers, and then count, and then recite a Hail Mary twice. And that will give you a perfect boiled egg. And at that point, the whole of the 17th century slightly shifted for me, because I realized they didn't have clocks, so they couldn't time their dishes. They didn't have thermometers, so they couldn't do the temperature. But they had other thermometers. They watched the water. They had other timers. They prayed. And so at that time, there were details like that which I found in the research, and all of those went into the book. And that's what the book's about. John himself is driven, and he has a single gift. He has a wonderful sense of taste. Every time he tastes a dish, he can understand all the ingredients which went into it, and this enables him to rise to the top of his profession. And the woman who he's involved with, Lucretia, is the opposite. She's in denial of her true status, which is as the daughter of the Lord. She won't marry the person that she's meant to marry, and as a result she goes on hunger strike. So she's in denial about sustenance and the body. And then behind these two archetypes, I had the vision of Adam and Eve in the first garden, which is when the feast that John prepares, was first conceived for mankind. I think, perhaps this is controversial, but I think that we ate before we prayed. And that prayer is something that we've done since we've learned to feast, and in some sense it's taken its place. But a good feast, of course, is somewhere where everyone sits down together. It's not just that you eat well, it's who you eat with. So the characters in the novel, I thought of them as calling them to this great feast, a kind of feast of words, because I can't put the actual dishes in the novel. I can only describe them, and I made great efforts to describe them accurately. And everyone's invited, all the characters from the highest points in society to the lowest points in society, from one side of the religious spectrum, the Catholics, to the other side of the religious spectrum, the Puritans. They're all invited to this feast, and I hoped that readers would all be invited to it too. Yes, there is. The feast has different forms as we go through the book. Behind the book, as I said, is this first feast, which is Eve giving Adam an apple. That's the first feast. It's very simple, but it's a feast nevertheless. It's a gift of food given from one person to another. And then, as John works his way up through the kitchen, he conceives ever more baroque and complicated dishes, and he thinks that that's the feast. That these dishes, forgive me, these dishes should be. The more elaborate, the better. And then, in the end, he reaches a more simple view, which is that, as I said earlier, it doesn't matter too much what you serve. What matters is who you serve it to. The book has I think 13 chapters in the book, and each chapter is begun by a recipe, which is the cookbook later written by the main character, John Saturnall. So in a way, it's him looking back on his life through the recipes. And as the book progresses, you realize that it's him telling the episodes of his life, which you're about to read in the chapter that follows, but looking back from some time in the future. So that's the device which binds the book together. So in a sense, it is a cookbook. It has recipes. I wouldn't recommend anybody trying to cook them, though. The question that I've always been asked as I've taken this book has now been published in, I think, 13 or 14 countries, and the question that I'm always asked is, did you cook any of the recipes? And it's the question I always dread, because the answer, of course, is yes, but it's very difficult to cook 17th century food. It was a very sophisticated and complicated cuisine. So I attempted to cook some of the simplest dishes. I think roasted rabbit is one of the recipes which is mentioned in the book. And in every time, I completely failed. I just wasn't a good enough cook. If I could be a good enough cook, I wouldn't have needed to write the book, but so I wrote the book instead. The recipes follow an arc. They start very simple, they become very complicated in the middle, and then at the end they come down again to a kind of simplicity. And I realized, of course, once I'd finished the book, not while I was writing it, but once I finished the book, that what I was really writing about was art. That art was you can write in a too elaborate way, in a too baroque way, but eventually you come back to a kind of simplicity. And so in a way I was writing about my own work as well as the cook. The cookery is his art, and the book is mine.